Hey folks, this is the Love of Cinema podcast. We like to talk movies. If you like to talk movies too, you have come to the right place.
I would be wary to make a very content-driven film, not let's say headlined by a major star in Telugu. I'd be wary of doing that, you know. But I would not worry about that so much when I am doing a very experimental film in Malayalam and I have no star actually in the film as well. Because I know that the audience responds to a very nuanced storytelling as well. Same thing in Marathi as well. If you see our choices of films, we've made Cycle and Kashinath and so on and so forth.
Hey guys, this is Himanshu, and you're listening to the Love of Cinema podcast. Welcome back for a fresh new episode. I'm going to name a few of my favorite films from last few years, and you try and guess a common thread across them. The films are Andhadhun, Margaret Over the Straw, Madras Cafe, Manto, Manjunath, Queen, Bombay Talkies, Rangoon. They all have one thing in common. They all have been either produced or co-produced by Viacom18 Motion Pictures. Today, we have with us the man who's been running the show at Viacom18 Motion Pictures for the last 6 years, Ajit Andhare. The films which I just mentioned, all have come on his watch, so to speak. I thought it would be nice to reach out to him and invite him on the podcast to talk about a variety of topics, like navigating the production slate, approach for doing post-mortems of films, differences between the markets for regional cinema and Hindi cinema, explosion of content and OTT platforms from a studio's point of view, the issue of pay parity, and taking risks on newer talents, and much more. Ajit was kind enough to join us and talk in good detail and without holding back on all those topics. Just a quick friendly note about the podcast before we move on to our conversation. If you're listening to this podcast for the first time, do check out our past episodes. If you enjoy similar conversations centered around films and streaming shows, do consider subscribing. You can find the Love of Cinema podcast on all major podcasting apps. Also, do review us on Apple Podcasts when you get a chance. It would help us out and would be much appreciated. And now, here's my chat with Ajit Andhare, top boss at Viacom18 Motion Pictures. One of the reasons why I was looking forward to having you on the podcast was because some of my favorite films in the last 6 years or so, like Madras Cafe, Rangoon, Manto, Andhadhun,
Right.
As well as Marathi films like Ghanekar and Bhai, have
Yes.
all arrived over the course of the last 6 years on your watch, so to speak. So
Yes.
first up, I would love to hear from you on your approach towards populating the production slate and your mantra, so to speak, about driving the slate.
Yes, so I'm glad we're having that conversation and that someone has noticed that there is, let's say, one studio behind all of this. Usually, the studios get drowned out in the, because you've always got stars and rightly so, fronting the discussions. But I'm glad we're having the chat. In fact, my approach actually has been to not focus on the slate at all. I believe slate is a very sort of almost a bit of a misused word because the audience doesn't watch a slate. They watch a film, and therefore my approach has been really that one has to go film by film, and a film has to have a very good reason to be made. Uh, and if a film makes sense, then the resultant slate, which is a collection of those films, will make sense. Um However, one has to keep in mind that when we talk about various markets, since you spoke about Hindi, Marathi as well, each market has a very different mix of audience, and therefore the kind of stories that you choose to tell, choose to greenlight or choose to produce, have to be in line with what market you are facing. So, for instance, the Marathi audience is a very content-driven audience. It doesn't so much care or respond as much to stars as some of the other markets. Malayalam is also a market like that, very story-driven, content-driven.
Right.
While Telugu is very conventional in the sense that it's still very star-driven, and Hindi is in the midst of a very interesting transition, which we, in a sense, spotted early, and started making the so-called new age or the differentiated cinema. Some of which you named as well. So I think to each market and to each audience, there is a phase in which they sort of respond to different kinds of storytelling. And once you are conscious of that, keeping the audience at the heart of it, then you go about sort of picking and selecting the stories that you want to tell. That's been the first maxim. The other maxim really has been that to not uh, sort of look at the films in a conventional manner, like the industry usually used to look at it in a very conventional manner. Typically, Hindi films used to be very star-led, star-driven. The approach we've taken at Viacom18 Studios is that there is audience out there which will respond to anything which is unique and powerful enough, and that unique dimension need not be in star. It can actually be in a story as well, and which is why you see films like a Bhag Milkha or a Queen or a Kahani or more recently Andhadhun. So these are all, if you notice that they're actually very strong on the written material. They're strong scripts. They either have something very powerful in terms of the plot or a high concept. They're structurally uh, they're structurally stronger material, and therefore that's what I have uh, focused on rather than relying on purely star power. You would also notice that all of these still had reasonable, star power in those films as well. So there is a balance that you need to strike in terms of how do you still reach a film to a large number of people, which is where the casting comes in, and it's important to have some weight of cast in these films. But at the heart of it has been a powerful story and a unique story, and in fact something which usually has not been told. And that's been the attempt to sort of choose narratives which have been untried, which have been new, and to take creative risks and take it with an audience which is clearly seeming to respond to it. And that explains the kind of cinema that you see coming from Viacom18 Studios.
Correct me if I'm wrong. So, as I understand, you said your approach is essentially, you're emphasizing on the content and the story, and then moving from there. And like you said, the markets are different for regional as compared to Hindi. What kind of major differences are there when you're making that call as to, let's say you have a movie, right, that you would like to green light. Let me give you an example. Like, for example, I know that when Rahi Barve was trying to make Tumbad, he wanted to make it in Marathi because it was essentially in the Marathi milieu, right? But
Yeah.
it wasn't possible to make it in Marathi because of the market dynamics and the commercial aspects and the budgeting of the film, if I understand it correctly. So, what kind of analysis and what kind of approach do you take there as to what kind of material is suitable for regional markets, and what kind of material should be is greenlit for the national markets?
So, as I said, even within regional, the markets are very different. So, you have to look at each language market as a separate one. So, if you take, for instance, we made a Malayalam film with Dilip recently, which ran very well in the theaters.
All right.
Malayalam and Marathi, these are what I call story or content-based markets. They respond to stories very well. So you can do a lot of experiments. In fact, to your point, I think Tumbad should have been made in Marathi. I think it would have possibly made a greater noise. It would have had possibly a greater, share of audience as well. Although it did, of course, make an impact in Hindi as well. So these language markets are the ones which actually need not have a star in a film for the film to succeed. and therefore you can be far more open to very different kinds of storytelling. In fact, even in Tamil, if you see, there is a film recently called Super Deluxe, which is a
Yes,
very eclectic film. It's a film that I absolutely love, and I think I
wonderful.
often tell my Hindi colleagues that we are so far away from making a really modern film in that sense, or a new age film, which some of the regional markets are making. In this case, Tamil. But what happens is Tamil Telugu still are essentially fan based culture. You still have your massive following for the big stars. You have the first day rituals of people turning up since early morning, even now, to watch a Rajnikant film and all of that. So those undercurrents are unique to Telugu and Tamil to an extent. Those are not so much prevalent in, let's say, Malayalam or Marathi, and these are therefore very different markets in which you would actually pick very different kind of films, which is why Telugu is great at making the Prahubalis, the Sahos, the high drama, high scale, uh, a little over the top kind of aesthetic that is very, very sort of ingrained in that market, and which that audience responds to very well.
Big action
Is
set pieces.
big action set pieces, and a little, the sort of over the top theatrical. If you see the narrative of Bahubali or Saho, the drama is not, it's not realism. It's far away from realism. It's way over the top. It's very filmy, as we say. Now that audience responds very well to that kind of cinema. So I think those are some of the characteristics that you do keep in mind. So for instance, I would be wary to make a very content driven film, not, let's say, headlined by a major star in Telugu. I'd be wary of doing that. you know but I would not worry about that so much when I am doing a very experimental film in Malayalam and I have no star actually in the film as well, because I know that the audience responds to a very nuanced storytelling as well. Same thing in Marathi as well. If you see our choices of films, we've made Cycle and Kashinath and so on and so forth. Yes, of course, these films are some. I mean, Kashinath had Subodh in it, but I think the main driving force is that stories and scripts and experimentation is rewarded by certain kind of markets. So make those for those markets, while stay with the kind of response which fans give in another kind of market. I think that to me is an important aspect to keep in mind.
And since we are talking about Marathi films, I was going to come back to this later, but let's segue there first. So I think you touched upon this, but I would just like to drill down a little bit more.
Sure.
For example, I had posed this question to Abhijit Deshpande and Nipun Dharmadikari when they were guests on this podcast, and they gave me very interesting different answers. And I will try to ask you the same question, and I would
Right.
love to hear your opinion on it. You said it's a different market, and they're driven through different dynamics. For example, the southern markets are more star driven and they're more like star vehicles. But like, for example, why don't we see the kind of genre smashing, edgy cinema in Marathi? We have had some great Marathi films, and two of those were Viacom pictures in recent memory. Kashinath was an excellent picture, and I also love Bhai, the Purva
Right.
biopic, a lot.
Right.
But why
Right.
don't we see pictures like the ones that you mentioned, like Super Deluxe or like the Telugu movie Awe? And these can be, in fact, there doesn't have to be a star because these are totally content driven. So, for example, something like a fresh retelling of an iconic Vijay Tendulkar play, reimagined around a major political party of the day, or maybe like a graphic novel like treatment to, the legends of stories like Safikar Brothers. And I'm always wondering why and when we will see this kind of cinema in Marathi.
No, that's a very interesting question. I have a hypothesis. I think it has got to do with the makeup of the audience and the larger sort of culture in that region. So Marathi, for instance, is the Marathi audience is a fairly the culture is fairly classical. It looks towards the past. Any culture which is coming from a great heritage, whether it's in their literature or it's in the freedom movement. Maharashtra is very, very culture rich, and so is, for instance, Bengal as well. And I think what tends to happen is, therefore, when a society uh, it looks a lot at its heritage, and it's a little classical in its thinking, it tends to look back to celebrate, let's say, the glory of the past, and to mine the fine literature, or to mine the fine giants that have happened in any milieu. Which is why you see, whether it's whether it's the story of Lokmanya Tilak, or whether it's the story of Kashinath Ghanekar or Bhai, we love. I mean, I'm a Maharashtrian, and we love our icons so much, our
Right.
literary icons, that we tend to respond to them a lot more. Now, the interesting part is, also, I think the audience profile is slightly older. If you really drill down into the demographics, let's say a Marathi audience today is a far younger audience, and I'm talking about theater going audience, compared to a Maharashtrian audience, which tends to be a little older. So I think slightly older demographic, an approach of nostalgia, romance, and celebration of your heritage and past makes us mind those subjects, a lot more than in some of the other places, which simply don't have any of those cultural foundations. I mean, for instance, why is America making films only on comic books? Because there is no other cultural sort of basis, or sort of literature in that sense, which feeds popular imagination. While popular imagination is fed a lot still by the cultural sort of rootings in a Maharashtra or in Bangla, which is why a Feluda keeps on getting made, and a Satyajit Ray literature keeps on sort of re-expressing itself, and so on and so forth. So these are slightly more looking at the past and having a lot of pride in their past kind of societies, which by corollary may not be the best place to do some of the more modern experimentation of the kind that you refer to. And I'm not saying that or it will absolutely not work, but it tends to be favoring the past rather than go and try something completely new. Because you need a slightly different audience profile, which is possibly a little more freer in its mindset, a lot more open, a lot more experimentative, possibly a lot younger, to embrace some of these newer forms, formats, or experiments. So many times when we get something new or modern, in fact, there is a subject which was very dear to us, but we were not sure whether the Marathi audience will actually embrace a subject like that, but because it's very modern, very progressive, and almost anything which is modern and progressive ends up challenging what is traditional and what is held therefore dear and sort of sacred by some of these societies, and that tends to sort of veer people more into the heritage and past for the hunt of subjects and stories, rather than do experiments with a more risky future oriented subject.
Interesting that you mentioned it. Is there anything you can tell us more about that subject that you were just referring to?
I mean, yes. I mean, it's a subject which has, for example, a far more modern take on relationship. For example, let's say at the heart of it, the subject is a relationship with a person, let's say, who's dying, and where this woman from abroad falls in love, and in fact, ends up having his baby, and so on and so forth. Now, some of these themes are very modern, because they challenge what is the notion of what we consider, let's say, the sanction of a family for a certain kind of relationship, and so on and so forth. So whether I mean, we've explored, for example, issues like a widow remarriage. There has been a film like a Kaksparsh, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a very interesting thing that we are open to questioning, some of the norms within the boundaries of what the past has been. But when it comes to sort of taking that same conversation in future, I'm not sure what will be the response of the audience. So I think it's also a bit of a worry as to whether this audience will take it will embrace a subject like this or not. Personally, I think it's a deeply moving film. It's a greatly progressive sort of thought and refreshing kind of cinema that one would want a Marathi cinema also to embrace. But because of this classical nature, one is not sure whether we can pick that direction as of now. And these are the kind of sort of judgment calls that go into lot of subjects that we select across markets, a lot of films that we choose to produce or not to. And of course, some of these calls may not be right all the time, but we have to make those calls.
Well, I hope you certainly get to making that film. I, for one, would love to watch movies around subjects like these. So,
Yes.
but that's a market
Yes.
of one, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I mean, Hindi, for instance, today is opened up a lot more than it was earlier. So Hindi market, if you see, which is why Hindi is in such an
Sure.
exciting space to tell various kinds of stories. And I think, I mean, if you look at some of the recent successes, like even the Tashkent Files and Badla, the kind of numbers it did. Of course, Andhadhun is a big example of, as to how open the Hindi audience has now become. And when I say Hindi, it's actually the multiplex audience. So the multiplex audience, in some sense, is actually very homogeneous across markets. So the multiplex audience in China is very similar to the multiplex audience in India. They're all educated. They're all sort of economically very well placed, and they are actually paying for the experience, and they are open to different kinds of storytelling. And that perhaps explains why a film like Andhadhun succeeded so well in China. Because if an urban multiplex audience can respond to it in one geography, it will respond to it in another geography as well. And that hypothesis has played out correctly, as we've seen how the Chinese, which is a completely different set of audience, have embraced the film the way an Indian multiplex audience embraced the film.
Ajit, how easy was it greenlighting a film like Andhadhun? Was it a complete no-brainer, or was there some thought behind it when you guys first heard the script?
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting question, because see, originally there was supposed to be a star who was to play this role, who backed out. He didn't actually eventually take up the film. When we heard the film was still in development. It was not fully ready. Almost 70% of the script was ready, but we still had to work with Sriram and his team to sort of develop the film further. What drew me to the film was that it was again, very strong plot-driven subject. So it was a structurally very, very strong film, because it keeps ahead of the audience. You're always guessing as to what is happening next. You rarely get plots of as tight and as well woven as that. Usually you will, as an intelligent audience, know, okay, where is this headed? And therefore, I was very convinced that we have to do this film irrespective of who's really playing the lead, because the strength of the film is a very, very unique sort of atmosphere that is there in this film, which is very, very dark and macabre. At the same time, you're actually having fun. You don't see this kind of a combination usually at all, and therefore that clearly was the second aspect, other than the very strong plot, that drew me towards this film. And of course, then we went into casting, and we had various options, and finally we settled on to Ayushman, and that of course proved to be a great casting. He performed the lead very well. But to me, this was always a story. It was always the uniqueness in the plot and the uniqueness in the flavor of the film. Where do you get? How often do you see dark humor in Bollywood? You may see it in Hollywood, but you don't see dark humor that commonly done. So when you see a dark humor, a plot-driven film, you will of course be drawn towards it. So it wasn't tough at all. But developing the film and then saying that, okay, how are we going to sort of develop the second half, post the organ mafia, and so on and so forth. So that was a very long process, and that was interesting. And I think that's something we enjoyed a lot. So it has actually been more of an organic journey of this film coming together, rather than simply picking this completely ready film. It's something that we went along to develop, and we ended up being where we are in terms of what that film, the whole story turned out, and the way then later, of course, it was embraced by the audience.
That's great to hear the story behind Andhadhun. It's my favorite film of last year, hands down. And in fact,
Right.
even for this year, up until Son Chidiya, which I really loved as well.
Right.
Next, Ajit, I wanted to ask you about post-mortems of films, especially of those, which don't meet your expectations. Because honestly, I mean, we all have expectations, right, about whatever we are working on. And when they're not met, how much time do you guys spend on doing the post-mortems of a film? And what's your approach towards that? And then I wanted to segue to the next question based on your answer for this, but I'll let you elaborate on that first.
Yeah, so see, postmortem is inevitable because each film is like a relationship that you are in. You commit yourself based on certain instinct, certain gut feel, some judgment, some objectivity, and a collection of all of these things, right? So it's like getting into a relationship, and it's also a long-term relationship because you stay with the subject right through the scripting, casting, production, everything, and you evolve and so on and so forth. So naturally, when a film with which you stayed and a relationship to which you've committed, it doesn't sort of go in the direction that you anticipated or hoped for. It is a humongous amount of heartbreak, and that's why I use the analogy of relationship. And it's inevitable to do a postmortem because once you see the full reaction in terms of how the various segments, whether it's critics or the audience or the numbers, once they come in, and you will then go back and say, okay, that which of these assumptions haven't played out. So we do that, but many times it really isn't very productive as well because it's first of all every film experience is very unique, and what happened to, let's say, film A may not necessarily mean anything to a new journey. So while the postmortems are inevitable first because you're so close to it, b, you're in a good position because you have all the initial sort of whatever hypothesis, logic, instinct, everything, and then the so pre and post is very clearly available. But what I'm not sure is how productive it is. For instance, take one of our films which did not work at all, Rangoon. Uh, it's very hard to piece it together as to why the film underperforms so much in the theaters. So while I can understand, some degree of performance not up to the expectation, but the film just absolutely was virtually cold-shouldered by at the box office, and that's something which we were stunned by, and we wonder even till now as to what really happened with that. So sometimes these things. I mean, you can analyze them, you can draw out certain conclusions. I'm not sure how useful they are because it's a theorem which may not then apply to anything else because a new subject is a completely new experience. It's a new set of assumptions. And if you make certain rules out of one learning and apply to the other, I think it can be very counterproductive. So it needs to be like, I think it's very much the Rahul Dravid analogy of play the ball on its merit, each ball as it comes, and then forget it, and then start afresh. I think that's the only way it works because if you keep thinking about the last ball and what did you think and how, then you lose confidence. Because the fact is, if you made a film, then you've invested everything in it, your belief, your thinking, your method, all of it. And if it has not come good, uh, and then you take that too seriously, then you will suffer from a phenomenal amount of loss of confidence because you're going back to the same instinct, the same, broadly the same method, and you're not really changing your furniture too much. When you face a new ball, you're the same batsman, right? So you can't actually. I think you can't possibly take too much out of a film. Of course, if there are some obvious mistakes you've made, then those are useful and you can know them, and you also know some of the risks that you've taken which you were hoping will be pulled off. Like we made a film called Budhya Singh, Born to Run. It is a beautiful
Yes.
film, and it's a tragic film. It is a difficult film, but a powerful one at that. And we were conscious that you know it wasn't really sort of wasn't really packed with a star cast of any great weight, and therefore that challenge would be there. But we were still hoping for a slightly better result. But it didn't come. But in that case, we know that okay, this is a film which possibly just couldn't go to the audience, because it had a certain star cast issue. So that you understand, and possibly you will sort of be more conscious of this next time over. But many times, like I tell you about Rangoon, it's hard to say. Even Raw, the film that we recently did, Romeo Akbar Walter, uh, uh, we expected a lot more from the film than what we got. So these are difficult ones. They're like a relationship. I don't know how much can you learn from one when you start another.
Well put, well put. So that I guess what we can distill that down to is that the takeaways that you can do based on the postmortems can't really be abstracted up, something that you can apply to other films. So I guess that's why you're saying that there's not much reason to do those postmortems. And it's interesting, I was talking to a prominent filmmaker a few weeks ago, and I asked him the same question as to
Mm-hmm.
if he makes any postmortems about films. And he said, absolutely none. He said, because
Mm.
simply because nobody knows anything, and you can never kind of pinpoint the reason it failed, just like you
Yeah.
cannot pinpoint the reason that a particular film clicked. You might think so that, it clicked or it failed because of this reason, but that's just one man's opinion. And, you cannot really abstract that out.
Yes, so I think I by and large agree with that, but there are two parts to it. I think there is certain use of a post-mortem as far as only that film is concerned, because there you can say, okay, these were my various ingoing assumptions. This is what panned out. So at least I know which worked, which didn't work, which is useful to a certain extent. Where I'm saying the second part is to abstract something out of it and then to apply it to another film can be very dangerous because,
Right.
as I said, that film is a different journey, and I can't therefore pluck out lessons from this one failure or success and apply to another one. So I think those that algorithm, that method, or that instinct, all of that pretty much remains same. Hopefully, it learns something from this experience, and sort of the attempt is that you try and sort of improve and sharpen. But yes, I would tend to agree with what the gentleman said, that I think, and to me the reason is because every film is such a different and very unique relationship. However, if for instance you are making a sports biopic and you have done sports biopic, then clearly there are learnings that are transferable. So that, okay, what are the things which have worked, and what are some of the things to which audience responded within a certain kind of storytelling, within a certain kind of a genre. Or if you take a thriller. So I think within stories which are similar or which are kind of in a similar emotional space, there is some amount of learning that you can certainly do. But that's again at a very nuanced level, and hard to sort of pick at a very large level and point it out that this can be sort of transferred and so on and so forth.
Makes sense. Yes. And you already touched on Rangoon, but that's the question that I was going to segue to. Personally, I really like Rangoon a lot. It's quintessentially Vishal Bharadwaj, in that it's beautifully nuanced. The songs are expertly woven in with the narrative. And it's just a fascinating interplay between politics and cinema. And in
Absolutely.
my opinion, it's easily among one of Kangana's and Shahid's best performances. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, I know you said that you guys tried to think a lot about this, and it's difficult to pinpoint what could be behind its inability to connect with the audiences. But just in your personal opinion, as a goer, what is there anything that you took away as to from the failure of this film?
I'll tell you why it's difficult to answer that. I'll still try and attempt it. So there are two things here. One is that how good was the film and what was the response to that film. That's an answer you get once, let's say, a film has been seen by the audience. The trouble that happened with Rangoon is that very few people went and actually saw the film, which means the problem was in terms of getting people to the theater. Now, what is it that made people stay away from it? It was a powerful cast. It is a unique triangle. It is a period piece. It looks spectacular on screen in terms of, the material that was put out for promotion and so on and so forth. But what is it that if you see the numbers and the kind of first day box office and the audience and footfalls that we got, that is where the shocker was, that when you put together a star cast of Shahid, Kangana, and Saif, and it's a Vishal Bharadwaj film with a certain level of mounting, you expect a certain kind of footfall to come through, and that may not, that what you get may be a sort of 80, 90%, 70% lower than what you expected, which is understandable. But what happened with Rangoon is that the actual footfalls were drastically lower. And that's something that we couldn't really put our fingers to as to why. So somehow people kind of stayed away from the film. I would have been happy to take a situation where people have seen the film and many of them may not like the way the film ended, or they don't like the second half, or they feel that it becomes a little, maybe the character turn of Saif is something which is hard to stomach for people. Those are absolutely, legitimate arguments, and to each his own. Cinema is subjective. But then we would have at least seen a certain kind of opening and a certain kind of consumption. The issue in Rangoon was that it was almost like a silent reception to the film. And that is something that we've not been able to piece together because we had a powerful marketing campaign going. There was significant amount of deployment. And it's like you call a big party and, and you have stars attending that party and all of that. And there's a lot of excitement. And you look at all your parameters because we have various dipsticks and various feedback research that keeps coming to us, which is pointing you in one direction. And then on that day, suddenly the number of people who turn up is half of your minimum estimate. That is something which is hard to pinpoint, and that's exactly what a lot of industry people also noticed, which is why people were a little stunned by the kind of response that it got at the box office in the initial days, and that's something which is hard to fathom. Coming to the film, yes, there were some views where people had, I think, in the second half, the film does change its color and the way the film concludes, especially when Kangana basically, runs to go with Shahid and the way Saif's character turns, and especially the bridge sequence, all of that, I think there are enough number of people who felt that maybe that wasn't consistent with the rest of the film, which was far more sensitive, and it almost became a little theatrical and so on and so forth, which to me are all I can live with all of that. But what is hard to understand is the kind of almost no show reception to the film that happened in the first 2 days or the first 3 days of the opening weekend.
I see. Well, here's hoping that the film does eventually find its audience, one way or another. And there are many instances of films being cult hits way after they have been released. So I'm hoping that Rangoon is one of those.
No, absolutely. And there are so many number of people who keep coming back to me and send me messages saying that it was actually an awesome film and they love the film. I think you mentioned you also love the film. So
yeah, I absolutely loved it. Yes.
Yes. But yes, that's the nature of the beast. Sometimes you have to deal with a complete heartbreak.
Now, Ajit, Disney is often criticized, for only making the big franchise films, reboots of old Disney hits, essentially, the big money spinners. Now, how do you keep a commercial shop, which at the end of the day does worship at the altar of ROI, like any other commercial venture, from falling into that trap and continuing to take risks and continuing to try something different, something out of the box?
Yes. So interestingly, the Indian cinema or Hindi cinema dynamics are very different from, let's say, the Disney dynamics that you're mentioning. Why I say so is because if you make a big star film in Hindi, actually the film does not have a great return. It is actually a less risky venture where the bulk of the value is appropriated by the star machinery. So it's actually a lesser, the big star. So therefore, it's actually a safer venture from a slate or a studio point of view. It's more a volume driver because you will churn bigger numbers. But actually, it may not return. It may not be very high on the return on your investment. That's because your investment is high and your returns are actually appropriated, as I said, by the star and the various things that go in the big film. On the contrary, so it's financially it's not a big risk. It's actually less of a risk, because star films in that sense, or the big franchise films, they have a greater chance of succeeding. If you see the other films, which are actually the kind of films that we spoke about, they have a far greater creative risk, but the return on them is much higher. Because if you see, most of them will be very tightly produced. It will be on tight budgets. It will be cast in a manner which is to the film, and therefore your costs are under control. And therefore, the returns that you make as a producer or as a studio on any such venture is actually going to be significantly higher. So we've consistently operated on this business model for now last so many years. So if you look at the 6 national awards that we have, 5 of them are also films which have commercially delivered big time for us. So if you see the first one, Bhag Milkha is a big commercial hit. If you look at Mary Com, it's a commercial hit. If you look at Queen, it's a big commercial hit, and so is Andhadhun. and none of them are sort of massively led by Starship, you know. So therefore, the point I'm making is actually these films are far better on ROE or return on or ROI or return on investment, and they actually give you far better commercial returns. What Disney does is, of course, Disney is using a lot of technology. It's using a lot of franchise material which they own. They're not so much star dependent, and therefore going and doing that is very remunerative for them. Of course, they are operating in a global market, so that is a very different dynamics at play. While in India, some of these mid-budget films which generate great amount of box office response actually also generate a great amount of commercial success for the studio, and therefore makes a lot of commercial sense.
How has the distribution model, which has been practically blown open by the OTT platforms, changed the business from a studio's point of view?
I think it's a great development because, see, what has happened is that distribution has always been the limiting factor when it comes to dissemination of content. So if you see theaters today, theaters in India are essentially what limits the films to just 3,000 or 2,500 for a big film, or smaller numbers of screens for a smaller mid-budget film. So the theatrical scenario in India is not bright at all, as compared to, let's say, either Europe or US or China. We are a hugely underscreened country. However, we are a massively cinema-loving audience. So the only way you are going to solve this problem is either you, like China, go and populate your whole country with massive amount of theaters, which is unlikely to happen in any recent future. There's no evidence of that happening. However, what you've got is this OTTs, and you've got the cable and satellite television, which is humongously distributing your content to various households. So the content can travel a lot, and a cinema crazy country can actually consume its cinema at any point of consumption. It is not only limited to theaters. So therefore, it's actually augured very well for the business of cinema. It's an additional channel which is actually the largest. Soon it's going to be the largest in terms of the number of people who will, the number of consumers that you will touch through this channel, and
Sure.
it complements the theatrical experience. See, what you will notice in India is that while the films are being consumed on OTT platforms, they have been consumed on satellite television. They're also doing very well in theaters. So if you see some of the smaller films as well, which normally you would say that, oh, these are digital films one would watch at home, they are all getting watched. I mean, Tashkent File, went close to 20 crores of box office. Uh, you know, Even Mere Pyare Prime Minister, or the other one, sorry, the other Prime Minister film, the Accidental Prime
Accidental
Minister,
premise.
Accidental. Even these films, which you would say, okay, nobody will watch them in theater, are getting consumed in theaters. So to me, it's actually, as I said, India is an and country. So this and that can coexist and thrive together, and that's what seems to be happening at the moment. And I think that's great news for filmmakers. You got multiple channels, the film will get and they don't compete. People who see in theater, they are going there for a theatrical experience. That's a small club which pays for that experience. Then you've got, of course, people who will who will consume it on a subscriber video on demand platform like Netflix, Amazon, or a Hotstar. And then, of course, you have people who will consume it on free on when I say free, part of their subscription on a cable and satellite television. So you are addressing three different segments through three different windows of time. And I think that's how any efficient product gets distributed across various consumers in any other sector as well. You've got multiple channels, multiple touch points by which consumers which value different experiences are paying for it. So it's a great place to be.
Right. And on the flip side, some argue that because of this, mushrooming of the OTT platforms and so many essentially platforms where you can put out the content, the quality of content has been diluted a bit. What's your take on that?
Oh, I completely believe in the contrary. I think the quality of content has only gone up. If you see the kind of storytelling that you see in a Sacred Games, or even in a Delhi Crime, or for that matter, even in Made in Heaven, which is on Amazon, um, it has completely opened us to diverse kind of storytelling. And I think any time when distribution opens the door and becomes more sort of wide and open, you will see new narratives and more open kind of, new kind of narratives and more kind of storytelling, spreading very well. How did it happen in theaters that so many different kinds of stories are being told in Hindi? It happened because of multiplex phenomena. Earlier, if you see, Hindi cinema was very, very monochromatic. It had only one common shade. Either there was a relationship drama, or there was this phase of an angry young man, or you're catering to a large single screen where everyone is seeing the same film and there is no other choice. So when you came to multiplex, you started seeing slightly more urban films like a Dil Chahta Hai or a Monsoon Wedding and so on and so forth, and which is why today an Andhadhun or a Badai Ho or even a Stree, gets consumed alongside a Total Dhamal. So I think every time distribution has opened up, creativity and the opportunity to content has thrived. This has always been the case, and the same is happening even in digital platform, because the lesser restrictions you have of distribution, the more risks you can take, the more diverse form of storytelling you can embrace. And you can see it in the way, if you see the kind of cuts that you see in a Netflix series, the kind of hard cuts you see, you would not see that in a more popular form of entertainment on, let's say, a TV or a film. So people are able to deploy those techniques of a hard cut, because they know that a very discerning and a new age audience is watching them, and there's no great worry of rejection. When you rely on distribution, one of the big problems is a great worry of rejection, which sort of pegs you back. That because distribution has a certain cost, I have to be very sure that only this content which works, I can supply that content. So the more your distribution risks reduce, you can take greater risks, and it has always led to more forms of new storytelling, more forms of creative output, and that's the direction we are going in.
Right. I think I agree with you. I kind of disagree with people who argue saturation and oversaturation, because I think what it eventually does is it raises the bar. And I think that's what we are seeing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Ajit, it's been now 2 years since the conversation around gender-based pay parity reached somewhat critical mass in the world of Hindi cinema. After Anushka, Kangana, Deepika, among others, really spoke out in a major way about the lack of parity. What progress have we made towards addressing that issue and moving towards parity?
Look, I think to me this whole issue has been framed in a very unnecessary narrative. When people say disparity, it seems as if somebody is designing this disparity and saying that, okay, you're a woman, so you're going to be paid less. You're a man, you're going to be paid more. No, it's not that way at all. Why have the stars commanded the kind of numbers or remunerations or salaries or fees that they've commanded? Is because they have also been box office draws, you know because they bring value in terms of getting people to theater on day one, which is why a producer puts those kind of dollars in paying them. Now, when women have started playing the lead role and audiences started coming to theaters, even for what we call the female-led or the women-oriented or women-led films, producers will be happy to bankroll women-led stars. So this is actually, in my mind, not at all an issue of gender disparity. It is essentially a simple film commercial logic. And film is a very secular business. Wherever there is value, your fees and salaries have all aligned them to the values. When a star is big, when he is successful, then he is always at its the peak of what he can command. When the same star starts not delivering, then his value becomes less. Is the same person with the same gender, then why is the disparity now? It's because of the performance, and it's because of for the response that he commands at box office. And that's been the case with the with some of the female centric films. And now that female centric films have started doing well, that has resulted in the remuneration for the leading heroines also going up. And it is not because somebody suddenly has woken up to the issue, oh, I need to pay the women also well, and so on and so forth. This just gets framed very wrongly, I feel. I think people are missing the real commercial logic that underpins the entire transaction. Star prices are a function of what they are able to bring to box office. And that's what has happened, and that's why the remuneration has gone up.
But let me pick your brain a little bit over there. So let's say we are not talking about stars, right? Let's say we are just talking about two good actors, one female actor and one male actor, and let's say both of them have supporting roles in a particular picture. Do you think we are at a position where both of them will be are in a position to demand the same kind of compensation?
Absolutely. The way a producer will arrive at that compensation is what is the weight this person is bringing to the film and what are my other options. Actually, people don't realize how what is the word, how secular and how, when I say secular, I don't mean in the religious sense, but how person agnostic some of these things are. You are really trying to make a product where you are incurring a cost and you are going to see a certain return, so you judge these things by what return you will bring, and same goes for supporting actors. And it happens many times. Many supporting actors, they tend to ask a lot more, and then you take a call that, okay, this doesn't add value to my film, so I will actually cast someone else. So this is actually not a gender issue in my head at all. This is more a far more nuanced commercial related conversation, and not really not certainly so much a gender disparity as it is made out to be.
I kind of disagree with you on some of it, but I do also see your point in the way that this particular conversation has been framed, and it's just difficult to fathom when some of the major female voices, like the names that I took, believe that they're not being paid. Towards parity, it's difficult to see the argument otherwise. You know what I mean?
Yeah, which is what I'm saying. It's because how it has been framed. There is no concept of parity. Nobody is trying to do parity or disparity. You're essentially trying to just balance a cost and revenue equation. So what I'm saying is the underlying thinking is producer thinking is very different. He's not worried about these. And my best argument against it is that why is it that it is improving? It is improving because these films now led by women are finding audience. And if a producer is going to see audience come to theaters, irrespective of gender, he is going to pay them because they are getting audience to the theater. It's essentially a commercial business at the end of the day, and you have to balance your costs and revenues, and that drives a lot of these casting calls.
Ajit, now you have been running a studio for 6 years, right? Like we talked about before. What kind of advice would you give somebody who is just starting out as a young studio executive on two things? One, in dealing with superstars, stars with massive egos and massive leverage, and two, on taking risks on your talents.
I think one useful approach is always that studios have long been populated by the manager prototype, and I think that needs to change. I think studios need
Could
to
you
have a lot.
elaborate a little bit on that? What that means?
See, yeah. So I'm saying, studios typically have had a lot of people who come from the business side, or purely the marketing side. I think it helps a lot if the profile of people is someone who's actually has a lot more empathy and understanding of a maker. So you need a maker's profile. You need a content person, someone who has a content perspective rather than purely a business perspective. I think that always helps, because then you are judging a film or a material for what it is worth in terms of content, and not trying to put together a project for a certain sort of value that might add up on a spreadsheet. I think, to me, that's important. So for anyone working in a studio, I would say it's important to have a maker's perspective, which is why we've actually encouraged a lot of making culture within Viacom18 Studios. So most of my people in my creative team have all made short films by themselves. They have all written films, some of them direct films. And I think people who work on the other side of judging content, it'll do them a lot good if they do all of this, because it just refines their understanding so much. It just makes them far more uh, rounded to understand good material, to respond to good material, and to generate what I call the maker's perspective rather than a manager's perspective. Films is not like shampoo, soaps, or cars. It's a creative product. it's got a lot of heart, it's got a lot of subjectivity, and I think you need to have a certain degree of empathy, a certain degree of sensitivity of a maker, or a creator to be able to really be a good partner in a creative process. I think that's something that we have followed and we benefited a lot from in Viacom18 Studios. And some of these things are far easily done than they are thought to be done. It's not that hard to try and so we have a big short films culture here where there's a lot of short films watching, there is a lot of short film discussions that happens, and that therefore creates a maker's culture. You understand what it is to take a shot, you understand what it is to have an appropriate graph in a film, you understand what do you mean by that, a person playing a role or a person being a character, a person sort of bringing a certain kind of a magical performance to a moment. Some of these things are hard to understand if you only approach them intellectually. It is important to experience them to get a far more visceral feel of what these things are. And that's what makes cinema or content making different from any other product. That it is a lot about how you feel, because ultimately the whole attempt in a cinematic journey is to move a person who's watching that film or consuming that story. We are in the business of moving people. So how will you do that unless sort of you don't have a great empathy, understanding of what it takes to move people? So I think having a maker's mindset will round off your objectivity very well, and will put you in a great position to be a very very sort of sought after partner for various creative people, who are into the who are in the process of making films. I think that's an important aspect to sort of keep in mind.
And what's your advice on taking risks on your talents and this were like debut talents?
You don't take risk on debut talent in many ways. While it comes across that way, you're actually taking risk on something else in which there is a debut talent. So for instance, you might be taking a risk on the story, in which there is a debut talent. So I think that's an important aspect, which is you should be sure what are you betting on. So for instance, we bet a lot more on material, we bet a lot more on story, which is what gives us a great degree of comfort to therefore also work with people who might be new, because we are relying a lot more on the hardware, and hoping that this hardware will essentially deliver. So I think sometimes that gets spun across as a story of saying, oh, we bet on the newcomer, but actually newcomer happened to be in a story on which we were betting. That's part one. In terms of betting on a newcomer, we actually then it comes to purely whether you are backing a certain sort of acting talent, and that is again extremely subjective. And this is something which we've sort of done less often. We've been far more far more on the side of material and on the side of the making talent. For example, new directors, if I'm working with new directors, then the one currency that I look for is that are they going to give their life for this project? I think creativity at some level is all about desperation. Everybody can be creative if he's desperate enough. Why does a person come up with a poem? Because he's desperate to express himself in a certain manner. So if a director is really desperate, when I say desperate, I don't mean it in the sort of negative sense. When he's going to sort of exchange
Hungry.
anything to hungry, anything to make that film, to tell that story. I think it's a great it's a great ingredient to rely on, because then you will get the magic that you're looking for. You will get that, because we see, ultimately we forget that film is about, it's a performance art, right? Everyone is performing. So in that moment when a shot is being taken, an actor is performing, and a director is doing a very important performance of either agreeing to that performance or to say no, there can be a better one. So it's a very in the moment profession. So which is why I emphasize the heart bit, the empathy bit, and the feel bit, and the hunger bit. Otherwise you can just okay any shot and sort of get by, and and you will say that okay, I just don't feel that punch in the film. So I think everyone has to punch above their weight. They have to give their absolute best, and then all of this has to come together. This is a very arduous task, isn't it? when so many
Right.
people don't possibly even meet each other, which is where I think it becomes important that the passion, I think, overrides a lot of other things, and it will compensate for a lot of other things. And a lot of other things can be learned, can be borrowed, can be bought in terms of expertise and so on and so forth. But you can't buy passion, that has to be ingrained. I think that's the other thing we look at when we are trying to look at, when you say betting on something new, whether it's director or even sometimes possibly the actors as well. Although I have said that we haven't gone to the new actor route as much.
Right. And finally, Ajit, a couple of recommendations. What are you watching right now, or what are you reading right now? And one recommendation about, again, a book, a show, or a film about the business of movies.
I would recommend to anyone who's a Hindi film watcher, please watch this film called Super Deluxe.
Yes,
He
yes,
just spoke about that.
fabulous film.
It's absolutely an awesome film, and it actually tells you what storytelling can be. And therefore I think breaks completely new grounds. It's hard to describe to someone who's not seen that film as to what it is all about. It's bizarre in some sense. I think that's something which I will certainly recommend. What else am I doing right now? What else am I reading? I was reading something.
Especially
Yes,
about the business of movies, or anything related to movies.
I think you should read stuff which is actually outside of movies. I'm just reading Satyajit Ray's best collection of short stories, and I'm amazed at how
Nice.
much good material is out there, and how those stories have been written, and there is uh, so much power in them. There is so much of an atmosphere that he manages to generate. I think people who are making films, they need to sort of keep themselves open to a lot of stuff outside of cinema. We tend to get
Yes.
boxed into our own world, and I'm always trying to open it and say, okay, go and read some books. I think we should read more books. I'd recommend this. I'd recommend Amitav Ghosh's trilogy called Ibis. If
Yes.
somebody is
Yes.
thinking of making a grand scale cinema or series, I absolutely think that it's a wonderful piece of literature which I'm dying to see on screen.
And any exciting projects that you guys are working about, which you can talk about just briefly?
Oh, yes. So we are right now working on developing. We are close to, in fact, hopefully we'll get into production soon in a few months. So this is the story of the Indian women cricketers, centered around Mithali and the nucleus of the women
Oh,
cricket team
lovely. Okay.
that has achieved so much. So we were talking about women led films, and this is a time when especially sporting women in India have really punched above their weights. Whether you look at Hima Das, or whether you look at the other lady who won uh, in a motor rally. I forget. I think her name is Pisse. I'm forgetting her name, Archana Pisse or someone. So I mean, there has been a spate of these women who've done really wonderfully well, and I'm somehow inspired a lot by women who sort of fight all odds and achieve
Oh,
beyond
yes.
what has been given to them. And I think in that sense, this is a story which is going to be a very exciting story. It's ironical that in a cricket loving country which is so crazy about its cricket, how can it be so ignorant about what its women cricketers have done? And therefore, to me, that's a very interesting space to tell a story. So we have developed this film in house completely. We've written it in house, within the studio. We've not even hired a writer for this. It's our own team who has written it, and it's now in a shape where we are casting it, and we are progressing that film. So that's a very interesting film that I'm very passionate about. Hopefully,
Is
uh,
there a director locked in?
we are just doing that as we speak.
Okay.
This is happening this week. Yeah. Plus, there is a lot of excitement on our regional front as well. So we are launching this Nikka Zaildar. Now, this is the other end of the spectrum. The fun Punjabi films. Which don't wear any content hat very seriously, but completely entertain, and they sort of. So that's the other end of the market. Which is so we are doing that on 20th. So this is a franchise film which is in its third outing called Nikka Zaildar, so which is headlined by Amy Wirk, and that's something that we are very excited about. As something which is we haven't done a lot of Punjabi films. In fact, in a long time, this is our first one, and we are hoping that we'll learn something new in this market, and hopefully there will be a commercial success that the film will achieve as well. So there is a lot of happening on the regional front. Telugu, Tamil. There are interesting films in Tamil. There is one which we are doing with Karthi, which is soon going to be announced. That is in the works. There is a film with Dulquer Salman as well, which is a very interesting film, Kannum Kannum, which is in the works. So there is some action which is happening down south. There is some development happening on Marathi, Punjabi film I spoke about. Of course, the other big one that's keeping us is very busy is Lal Singh Chadda, the film that we are doing
Oh,
with
yes.
Amir.
Everybody's looking forward to that.
Yes, so that film is something where we just finished the entire casting recently, and we've logged all the principal and the secondary characters, and we are now prepping. And Amir is also sort of in prep for playing for the lead role, and so that film is also in gearing up fully for pre-production.
That was great, Ajit. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate you coming in on the podcast and chatting with us. And I got a chance to ask you all the questions I always wanted to. So that was great.
Thank you, Himanshu. It's been a pleasure talking to you. We don't get a lot of meaningful conversations happening around this part of the world, so it's a good thing for a change.
I'm glad today you got a chance to do that.
Thank
Great.
you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ajit. That was my chat with Ajit Andhare. I'm glad we got to have a meaningful conversation, as he very well put it. I also appreciated Ajit talking about Rangoon so candidly, a film which I really liked and wished it had fared better at the box office. Before we wrap up today's episode, I wanted to read out a few comments from listeners which have made my way since the last episode. I'll start with Natasha's comment, who says, I recently started listening to your podcast on Castbox FM, and 2 episodes in, I'm a fan already. Hope you will include more writers and character actors. Thank you, Natasha. My goal with the podcast is to have people from all walks of cinema. If any of you have particular suggestions for guests, do chime in on Twitter. I'll definitely try to reach out to them. Moving on, next comment is from Ankit. Ankit says, Hey, I know it is easier said than done, but can we get Sriram Raghavan for one of your podcasts? I have like hundreds of questions to ask him. Ankit, thanks for your comment. And same here. Raghavan is one of my favorite filmmakers too. I'll definitely try to reach out to him. Next comment is from Manish. Manish says, Hey, loved your podcast with Abhijit Deshpande and Nipun Dharmadikari. Then, he says in Marathi, Tu Rahi Anil Barve Barobar podcast kar, which for those who don't speak Marathi means please get Rahi Anil Barve on the podcast. Hey Manish, thanks for listening, and I would love to have Barve on the podcast. I've been trying to reach him so far without any luck, unfortunately. But I'll keep trying, I'll tell you that. If you have a comment, suggestion, or anything which you would like to add to the conversation held on the episode, do drop us a comment. We would love to hear it. Also, you can follow me on Twitter at loveofcinemasf8 for podcast-related updates and my tweets on all things movies. That's all I got. See you next week. This is Himanshu signing off, and like always, thank you for listening to the Love of Cinema podcast.